There's a photograph in the back room of the Uvalde County Extension Office, tucked behind a filing cabinet that nobody moves anymore, taken sometime in the late summer of what the almanacs called the worst dry year in living memory for that stretch of the Edwards Plateau. In the photograph, 24 Longhorn cattle stand in a cedar draw, their flanks still rough with the dust of a journey nobody believed in. And behind them, the ground is dark and wet in a circle, roughly 30 feet across, and the water is sheeting off a limestone shelf in a thin, bright curtain, and every other pasture visible from that ridge is the color of a paper bag left in the sun. The woman who owned those cattle is standing at the edge of the frame with her back mostly turned to the camera, as though she was already walking away when someone thought to take the picture. Her name was Celia Voss. She had paid $37 total for the herd, a fact the county agent had written in his notes that spring with a small exclamation mark that he later crossed out, apparently embarrassed he had bothered. Nobody in the photograph is smiling. The water is running and the cattle are drinking, and that is enough. This is the story of what she knew that they did not, and how she came to know it, and what she did with it when the time finally arrived and the sky confirmed every single thing she had been told. The question people asked for years afterward was not how the spring opened. Springs open. Rock shifts, pressure builds in the aquifer, a seam fails. The question, the one that kept the old-timers talking at the feed store through 2 more decades of ordinary summers, was why she bought those particular cattle, those gaunt and mocked and practically skeletal animals, for $37 in the first week of April, when every sensible rancher in 4 counties was selling down their herds, cutting their losses, and thanking God quietly for whatever they could recover before the broker's price dropped any further. She had no money to spare. She had a deceased husband's debts, 42 acres of cedar and limestone caliche that most people would not have called a ranch by any generous definition, and a reputation that had already taken the shape it would hold for the rest of that bad year, which was the shape of a woman who had not yet understood what had happened to her and was making decisions from inside her grief rather than from inside her judgment. She had understood perfectly. She simply could not explain it to anyone who had not read what she had read, and she was not the sort of person who tried. She had been reading the journals since January. They were her husband's father's journals, written in pencil in a hand so small and cramped that she used a magnifying glass for the entries where the old man had clearly been writing by lamplight, the letters shrinking as his eyes grew tired. Augusto Voss had kept a journal every year from 1912 until the spring of 1951, and the journals filled a wooden crate that had sat under the bed in the back room for as long as Celia had been on the property, which was 11 years, and she had never opened it because it was his family's private record and she had not felt it was hers to read. When her husband died in February of that year, she pulled the crate out and began at the beginning, partly because she needed something to do with her hands in the evenings, and partly because she suspected, in the formless way that grief sometimes produces a useful instinct, that the answer to whatever question she had not yet formed might be sitting in pencil under her bed. She was right. Augusto had been what people called a close watcher. He had recorded rainfall by the quarter inch, noted which cedar draws held moisture longest after a rain, tracked the behavior of the feral cattle that had ranged the limestone country since before his father's time, and paid particular attention to what the cattle did in the dry years, of which he had lived through several. There was an entry from 1918 that she copied into her own notebook in blue ink, because the handwriting was too small to read quickly in the field. The entry read, in its entirety, The old, mossy-horned cattle go where the seam water is. They do not go where a man supposes water to be. They paw at limestone faces and at cedar root tangles along north-facing draws. They are not looking for surface. They smell it from below. The modern cattle do not know this because they were never taught by their mothers and grandmothers who were never taught, because we took them too young for 4 generations running. Find the old cattle. Follow them, patient. She read the entry on a Tuesday. On the following Monday, she drove to the Garza auction in Uvalde and paid $37 for 24 Longhorns, that the auctioneer described without obvious cruelty as aged, distressed, and of uncertain value, which was the polite way of saying they were old and thin and nobody wanted them, and which was precisely why she wanted them, because old meant they or their mothers might still carry the behavioral inheritance that Augusto's journal described. The learned, homing behavior of cattle who had been allowed to stay long enough in a hard country to learn its secrets. And thin meant the seller was desperate, and the price was therefore $37 total for 24 animals, which was less than the cost of the gas she burned driving there and back. The county agent came out that same week. His name was Donald Price, and he was 34 years old and had a degree from Texas, A&M, and a manner that conveyed a profound and nearly innocent certainty in the value of the things he had been taught, which made him, Celia sometimes thought, genuinely impossible to be angry at. In the same way, you cannot be angry at a wall for being a wall. He walked the fence line with her and looked at the cattle, which were standing in what shade the cedar offered, and breathing in the particular heavy way of animals recently moved and recently stressed, and he told her he was concerned. He used that word several times, concerned. He said he was concerned about the condition of the animals, concerned about the carrying capacity of the range given the dry forecast, concerned that she was, perhaps, and he paused here and chose his word carefully, extending herself in a direction the economics did not support. He had brought a printout of the drought probability index for the region, which showed a 73% likelihood of continued below-normal precipitation through the following October. He unfolded it and held it toward her in the bright light. She looked at it. She said, "I know." He waited for more. Nothing more came. She was already walking back toward the barn. Her neighbor to the east was a man named Clifton Reardon, who ran 400 Angus on 1,200 acres, and who wore the quiet prosperity of a third-generation rancher the way some men wear a good hat, naturally and without thinking about it. He came by in May on the pretense of checking a shared fence line and stood watching the Longhorns for a while without speaking, in the evaluating way of a man who has priced a great many animals over a great many years. And then he said, "Well, Celia, those are some historic cattle you got there." He said it pleasantly. He meant it pleasantly. That was, as she later told her nephew, the part that required the most from her, the pleasantness. She said, "They're working cattle," he said. "Working at what?" and laughed a little at his own question, not unkindly. She did not answer. She had spotted one of the older cows moving along the north face of the cedar draw with her nose near the ground, and she wanted to watch. What she watched over the next 6 weeks was the following. The 3 oldest cows, all of them animals who would have been called worthless by any market standard currently in operation, moved systematically along every north-facing limestone outcrop on the property. They moved slowly and with evident purpose. They paused at certain locations for minutes at a time, pawing at the base of the rock or nosing at the cedar root tangles. 2 of those locations Celia had visited before and found nothing. One of them she had never examined because it was a steep draw choked with cedar and prickly pear that nobody had reason to enter. She began clearing the cedar from that draw in June with a handsaw and a mattock, working 2 hours in the morning before the heat became dangerous. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. There was no one she particularly wanted to tell. Her nephew Ren came out in late June. He was 22 and had recently finished a 2-year program in range management at a community college in San Angelo. And he was, of the people in her life, the one she trusted most to look at something carefully before speaking about it. He walked the draw with her on his second evening there and crouched at the limestone face where the oldest cow had returned 3 times in a single week, and he put his hand flat against the rock for a long moment. And then he looked at the cedar root tangle at the base, and he said, "This is damp." She said, "I know." He said, "There's moisture moving through this seam." She said, "Augusto thought there was a perched aquifer along this face. His notes put it at between 12 and 20 feet. Ren sat back on his heels. He looked at the rock. He was quiet for a while. He said, "What do you need me to do?" She handed him the mattock. They worked the draw through July. The work was the kind of work that does not look like progress because progress is invisible until it is not, and the only record of it is the soreness that accumulates in the body and the slow deepening of a line of disturbance along a limestone face that most people would have walked past without noticing. Ren worked mornings. Celia worked whenever the heat allowed. The cattle moved through the cleared cedar, and the oldest cow in particular returned to the face of the seam every evening, reliable as a clock, and stood there long enough that Ren began to call her the foreman, partly as a joke and partly not. Every evening, the foreman stood at the face. Every evening, Celia watched. Donald Price came back in August with another printout and a more serious expression. The drought probability had moved from 73 to 88%. The Rio Grande Compact Water Authority had issued a first-stage advisory. 3 ranchers in the next county had already sold complete liquidation and left. He sat at her kitchen table and laid the printout flat and explained with genuine care and the slightly louder voice that people use when they suspect they are not being heard, that the smart move was to liquidate the Longhorns now while there was still a buyer, that the Angus prices were going to fall further and she needed to act, and that he could make some calls on her behalf and probably get her most of her $37 back. She poured him coffee. She set it in front of him. She said, "I appreciate you coming out." He said, "Celia, I'm not sure you're hearing what I'm saying." She said, "I hear you fine, Donald." He drove away having accomplished nothing, and he would remember that drive for a long time. The water came through the seam face on the 14th of September at 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday, which Ren would remember exactly because he had just sat down with a cup of water of his own and was looking at the spot they had cleared when the rock face darkened in a line about 2 feet long, and then the line began to weep. It did not gush. It wept. It came through in a slow, steady, thin sheet, the way water moves when it has been held a long time and is finally given a way out. Ren did not shout. He stood up and walked to the house and said, "It's coming through." Celia put down her father-in-law's journal, which she had been rereading, and walked with him to the draw without speaking. She looked at the water for a long time. The foreman was already there, standing about 6 feet back, watching it the same way. September turned the screws. There had not been a measurable rain since the second week of May. The grass in Clifton Reardon's 1,200 acres was the color of old straw and made a sound like paper when the wind moved it, and his water system, which depended on a concrete tank fed by a windmill, drawing from a shallow well drilled in 1977, was pumping brown water with increasing irregularity. He had sold 200 of his Angus in August at a loss he described to his wife as educational. Donald Price's drought index had reached 94% by the 1st of October, and the agency had issued materials to area ranchers about emergency destocking, which was the official term for the thing that felt, to the people doing it, like surrender. Celia ran a pipe from the seam face down the draw to a concrete basin she and Wren had set in July, which had seemed, at the time, like premature optimism, and which was now full and running over the lip. The yield from the seam was not spectacular. It was not an artesian well. It was a slow, patient, consistent flow of cold, clear water that the remaining 24 Longhorns, all of them now visibly healthier than they had been in April, were drinking from every morning and evening. It was enough. It had been enough through the worst of August, and it was enough in October, and it would be enough, as it turned out, through February of the following year when the rains finally returned. The foreman, whom Celia had never named officially, had a calf in November. Nobody had expected it. Clifton Reardon drove up on a Monday in late October in a truck that looked, to Wren's eye, like it had been driven too fast on roads that didn't merit it. And he sat in the cab for a moment before getting out, the way a man sits when he is assembling something in himself that is hard to carry. He was 51 years old and had never in his adult life asked a neighbor for anything he could not eventually provide himself, and the cost of what he was about to do was visible in the way he walked toward the house, which was the walk of a man carrying weight on his back that was not physical weight. Celia met him at the gate. He said, "I need water." He said it quietly, and looking at a point somewhere past her shoulder. He said, "My well is gone to mud, and I've got 90 Angus. I haven't moved yet, and I don't know how many days I can keep them." She looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, just long enough to see that this had cost him exactly what it appeared to have cost him, and that adding anything to that cost was not something she was willing to do. She said, "Bring them." He looked at her. He said, "I'll pay the going rate for water rights. Whatever the broker." She said, "Clifton, bring them." She did not tell him she had been right. She did not mention the printout or the pleasantness of his observation about historic cattle. She showed him where the basin was, and she showed Wren how to manage the overflow rotation. And she went back to the kitchen where she finished the entry she had been writing in her own journal, which she had begun keeping in February in the same pencil and small handwriting tradition as Augusto, because she had decided by April that some things deserved to be written down for whoever came next. She charged nobody market rate for anything. She extended the access to the seam-fed basin to 3 more neighboring operations through November and December on the same terms she had offered Reardon, which were essentially the terms of a neighbor who has more than she needs, and a precise memory of who showed up in her yard with a printout and genuine concern. She did not extend these terms as charity. She extended them as a matter of record, because the journal of Augusto Voss had taught her that the land does not balance its books in single seasons, and that the debts a community owes each other compound quietly and are drawn down in ways that nobody sees coming until the draw runs dry or the seam face darkens and the water comes through. Wren stayed. He filed a water rights application with the Edwards Aquifer Authority in March of the following year, a process that required 8 months, and the testimony of a hydrogeologist who confirmed the perched aquifer system along the north-facing limestone draws of the property, which he measured at an average yield sufficient for a small but self-sustaining operation in drought conditions, not exceeding the worst recorded in the instrumental period, a phrase which made Celia smile when she read it, because Augusto Voss had not had a hydrogeologist. He had had cattle and patience and a pencil. There is a passage in Celia Voss's personal journal, written in December of that year, that her nephew donated to the County Historical Society in the year she died, which was 23 years after the photograph was taken. The passage reads, "The stone holds what the sky forgets." You can argue with the sky, but you cannot argue with the stone. Do not argue. Listen at the base of it and wait. The wooden crate of Augusto's journals went with Wren when he eventually took over the property. He built a shelf for it in the back room of what was by then a named operation with a registered brand and a modest but consistent herd of Longhorns descended from the original 24. And he kept his own journals in the same format, pencil in small handwriting, volume by volume in chronological order. And he showed his own children where the seam face was and how to read the rock for moisture, and how to watch the oldest cattle move along the north-facing draws in the dry seasons, because those things are not in any degree curriculum, and never were, and probably never will be. The photograph is still in the extension office. The water is still running in the draw. Not the same water, of course. Water is not preserved, only the path it knows. Donald Price retired from the agency in the early 90s and became, by his own account at his retirement dinner, a much more careful listener, a phrase he delivered with the particular rueful accuracy of a man who means it. He grew a garden in retirement and kept a rain gauge and consulted it every morning. He was, in the end, a good man who trusted the wrong kinds of knowing for a long time, which is perhaps the most common human error and the one that costs the most when the sky finally stops cooperating. Clifton Reardon's ranch changed hands twice. The concrete basin in the cedar draw that Wren and Celia built in the summer of that dry year was still intact when the second new owner walked the property with a real estate agent who could not explain what it was, or why it had been built there, or why the ground around it was noticeably darker and cooler than the surrounding caliche. And the new owner had enough sense to leave it alone, which Celia, had she been there, would have considered adequate wisdom for a beginning. The stone holds what the sky forgets. That is what she knew. That is what she paid $37 for. That is what the water was doing in the photograph, running off a shelf of limestone in a thin, bright curtain in the worst dry year in living memory. And that is what it has been doing quietly ever since. Patient as arithmetic, visible to anyone willing to clear the cedar and wait and listen at the base of the thing that holds it.